Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver. Chapter 4, in which Mirela Bardi takes on the world. She had just received a death sentence, Mirela thought, as she hurried out of the overwarm room on the heels of the other girls. The hindmost stumbled, her borrowed skirts that bit too long for her and her eyes streaming. As she sniffed, wiped tears and hair out of her face, Mirela slipped past, going down the good stairs two at a time, her unladylike gait at odds with the pale black mask she wore. One gadgie behind her meant time gained to find refuge for herself, and she refused to feel guilty about that. None of them would have stopped for her if they knew what she really was. On the landing, the oak-panelled stairs took a sharp right turn as the wide staircase descended into another level of the noble house. Straight ahead, a single narrow panel opened on servants' stairs, gnawed through the heavy stone of the keep like the channels of mites in old cheese. Run fast down the wide stairs, through the great hall and out into the dark, or obey and totter carefully down the steep steps into the kitchen, where she would be surrounded by living servants. Did they make their thralls watch when they fed? Make them stand there cowed, helpless and resentful the way Anka had stood, hating all, opposing nothing? As she wondered, the second girl pulled out of the housekeeper's supporting arms. "No!" Anka murmured something about food and rest, but the peasant girl hauled up her long skirts, tucked them into her decorative belt. Her face was swollen red with tears, and her hands fumbled at the task, shaking too much to be of any use. "What's the point of food? Rest! You heard what he said. I'm no safer here than out there. At least out there I'll have a head start on the rest of you." She glanced at Mirela, flinched guiltily away, and raced down the main stairs like a deer fleeing for the woods. It made Mirela laugh in a thin, desperate way to think she was not the only one. One behind her, and one visibly and obviously running, appealing to their hunting instincts. Good, one for either of them. That gave him at least half an hour before they came looking for her. "I am sorry," said the housekeeper, and gestured ahead of herself for Mirela to go down the servants' stairs first. They were steep and narrow and crooked, but she was a Bardi. She could dance on a rope slung between two trees. An uneven staircase was nothing. Oh, what a cheerless place the kitchens were tonight. Over the past week of semi-imprisonment, she had rarely seen them look so empty. No one was on the spit, no one in the scullery. A tray with soup and bread stood on a table next to the stairs, growing cold. The cook darted a frightened glance at her and looked away pointedly, concentrating on the housekeeper instead. "How do they expect me to run a kitchen like this? There's Dika gone now, too. She and all her family packed up and are running for the border. May the hounds of hell hunt her down." "Cook," Anka grimaced. "What a thing!" She choked, and Mirela took advantage of her distraction to pocket the bread from the tray. "What a thing to wish on anyone! I hope they get clean away to Transylvania, she and all her family." In other circumstances, Mirela might have told her plainly, "Your hope is of as little worth as her curse. It is your actions that count, and they condemn you." But this was hardly the time to start a debate on who to blame, and besides, Mirela had an interesting thought. A thought that just might save her. "I won't stay for food," she said, plucking at Anka's sleeve to remind her she still existed. "But thank you for dealing well with us this week." Anka had been motherly with them. as their bruises healed and the sallow marks of hunger and terror faded from their faces, as they had been washed and fattened up and made beautiful like prize ewes at a fair. She had no fondness for the woman, but little resentment either. Pity mostly, and contempt. "Show me out to the courtyard?" Anka's smile was a timid little thing, wary as a wood mouse. She took Mirela by the elbow and led her through pantries and boot-room to the outer door, opened it upon darkness. Distantly Mirela could hear the horses snorting in their stables, and someone even now so far lost to her existence and the threat against her as to be laughing. "I am sorry." Mirela grinned, because she had an idea in her hand, and that was all she needed to change the hunt from nightmare to challenge, to change the risk into a game. "I'm not dead yet." The door closed behind her with indecent speed. She guessed Anka did not want to risk witnessing what would happen if they caught her here. But she was glad of it. Waiting a moment for her eyes to adapt to the darkness, she picked out a candle lantern burning in the stables. The dim light of it showed her the cell-like stalls, the bulks of hay, harness, ploughs and wagons. And the horses, of course, sidling in their confinement with white around their eyes and their ears flitting forward and back. A cold night, and she was wearing finest lawn, so white it glimmered even under the starlight. She let her skin return to its own native brown, her hair to darken to black, changed the colour of the dress to dark blue. Already infinitely harder to see, she hunkered down to look more dog-like in shape, waited for the poor, sparse guard to pass, then loped over the empty courtyard and pressed herself into the closest horse's stall. The animals gave her a comfort the Gadger never could, solid and honest and understandable as they were. This was a lady's palfrey, an old and gentle beast, whose colour she could not tell in the brown light, but whose legs were socked to the knee with something paler, and whose eyes, framed with white lashes, looked blue. "You'll do," Mirela thought fondly, and hopped up on her back, legs astride. Leaning down, she rubbed herself, her scent, all over the horse's back from shoulders to withers. It angled an ear at her inquiringly, but calmed under the contact, and she whispered thanks to it for what it was about to do. When she slid down again, she lay in the gutter beneath the back wall of the stall and rolled to spread horse muck and piss all over herself. There. Now she smelled like a horse, and the horse smelled as though it had an enterprising horse thief perched on its broad back. Lifting the gate from the stall, she encouraged the beast out into the courtyard, with a gentle clucking and a hand in its mane. No one patrolled the walls, and all stood in the archway out from the castle's great entrance. The portcullis remained up and the bridge down. Who would want to invade, after all, a place that could so easily bite back? There were stories of those who had. Whole villages sometimes, treading up the serenely undefended path with torches and indignation. Fleeing, those who made it back, with minds overcome with fear, and bodies that sickened over the oncoming months. Villages that had to be burnt to the ground afterwards, their ruins seeded with salt. The Strigoi put no barriers between themselves and those who wished to visit. Normally the thought would fill her with an uneasy horror, but tonight it would work in her favour. She led the horse, hiding in its shadow, subsumed in its smell, out of the castle courtyard, to where it could see the long descent to fields ripe with juicy grasses. The horse sniffed the air, strained forward, and she let it go, out of the walls, out of the doors, out and away where anyone might expect the fleeing girl to head. Then Mirela, keeping to shadows and muddy places, dashed back to the keep itself and up to the main doors. These were shut against damp and wind, but a guard lounged on either side, in the kind of waking stupor that comes with the attempt to stay alert all night when nothing at all is happening. Mirela had seen the one on the left before at a wedding, when her clan were asked to dance and sing for the bride. Fortune smiled on her. She'd been quite prepared to go in looking like herself, a slave, looking like for employment at the master's house. Nothing strange about that. But now she rummaged through her memories, found a cousin of his. Name? No, she couldn't recall. But she remembered well enough the unruly, wiry hair and weak chin, the good cloth of her red skirts, the blue waistcoat, the slightly gormless look. When she trudged up the steps towards him, into the light of the fire basket that burnt above the door, she still smelled like a horse. But she looked like a completely different person. "Krina?" he exclaimed, straightening up with shock. Across the way, his partner too shook off apathy and gave her a look half outraged, half concerned. "What are you doing here? It's not safe." "I didn't mean to come in the dark," she said, thinking quickly. "The horse fell. It fell on me. So don't ask me why I smell like this. And it ran off. I had to walk. Please let me in before... It's no safer in here. You know that. You should be indoors." "I'm trying to be." "At home, I mean. Why are you..." A sensation as though the air had sucked backwards out of their mouths, as though something was trying to pluck the soul out of her nostrils using frozen wire. The other guard looked up, his eyes as white-rimmed as any horse's. "Peter, argue inside. Let her in." They cracked the door open a little. Peter pushed her through. Making her stumble. She caught a brief glimpse of mist like powdered moonstone writhing out of the distant kitchen doorway. It raised its front end like a serpent testing the air, floated toward the stable. Mirela knew she shouldn't hold her breath. There was no reason to do so. It would make no difference. But it felt as though she would die if she ever inhaled again. A shiver of killing cold began beneath her breastbone and threatened to shake her skeleton apart. The mist reached the stable and disappeared inside. Peter shut the door silently, quickly. "What are you doing here?" I came for a job. Because they don't touch the servants. I thought I'd be safer here than anywhere." Mirela didn't remember how Peter's cousin spoke, but fear seemed universal. Her shaky, high-pitched babble could have been anyone's. He looked at her for a moment, blank-eyed, and she had the sudden intense fear that he was another one like Vacarescu, who had somehow seen her for what she was, when even the Strigoi themselves had been fooled. But then he shook himself and said, Yes, quick, kitchens before it comes back." So for the second time in as many hours, she found herself down in the servants' domain. The cook scrutinized her intently this time, though it may have been partially because she didn't wish to watch, as the gardener and head groom went tramping up the stairs with a stretcher between them, and came back bearing a body. It gave Mirela no feeling of triumph at all, to turn her head and see the first girl. Did she ever learn her name? As limp and white as her dress, but for a small splash of red just above the heart. A handclap smacked sharp next to her ear. She looked back at the cook and didn't trouble to pretend she wasn't on the edge of throwing up. "What? Is she..." Cook suited her job, a round, pallid woman, flabby as an unbaked loaf. By the flaccid look to her jowls, she must once have been even fatter. "She's nothing to do with you or me," Cook said firmly. "What the folk upstairs do with themselves is none of our concern. But it so happens I do have a place you might fill. I expect you to work hard, not to complain, to scrub the stink of horse off you, and to be as virtuous as you would in your mother's house. I don't think I need to tell you what will happen if you prove unsatisfactory. Do not run that risk." It was going to be tough to keep this disguise up for any length of time. Peter would eventually get leave to visit his family. He would find out that his cousin had never been near the castle, and he would come looking for the impostor. That could not be helped. For now she was happy to scrub the stables off her and savour the feeling of being safe. And more than that, of having won. She had no time to fret over anything else. Tomorrow could worry about itself, and when it came, she would deal with it as she had dealt with this. She was Mirela Bardi, and in a contest between herself and the world had better watch out. Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, Chapter 5, in which, despite the marvels of the Vril accumulator, Frank's situation materially worsens. Frank's door slammed open, and a woman's voice cursed beneath its breath as she tried to catch it with her foot before it struck the wall. Frank watched curiously as a new chambermaid bustled through the gap, her arms burdened with 3 logs and a sack of coal. She stopped with a start as she looked down on him, and her stare pulled him out of the melancholy into which he had been descending over the past weeks. This was the first person not of the family to look him in the eyes since he had come here. Like touching the coldest ice, he didn't know if it froze or burnt, but it certainly woke him up. "You!" She dropped the fuel with a clatter. "I thought he'd had you long ago." This was not at all appropriate behaviour for a chambermaid. Frank felt quite dizzy with something very like relief. The maid stooped and put the logs in the log basket, tipped some coal on the fire, some in the bucket. "He can't have turned you," she said, as if to herself, "because it's still light outside. Did you take service with him? You did, didn't you? Damn, I shouldn't have—" "Wait!" Frank interrupted her before she could work herself into hysteria. She jabbed him with a pointy look for his raised hand, but fell silent. "Who are you? What are you talking about?" "Of course you don't know." She laughed with a small twist of condescension about her lips that Frank would have resented if he hadn't felt he deserved it so much. "It's probably best we keep it that way." Her voice sweetened and softened, an actress taking on a new role. "Forgive me, sir, I—" "No, you don't." Frank interrupted her as she was heading for the door, caught her wrist, cold and wider in his hand than it looked. Curious? But curiosity couldn't keep down the wild panic that was the other side of his relief. She couldn't look at him as though he was a real person and then just go away and leave him to his doubts. "Please stay and tell me what you mean. I'm a stranger here. I don't know anything, and I'm so lost. Don't just leave me here again. Please." She stood a moment thinking. An utterly unexceptional young woman with curly brown hair beneath a peasant headscarf. The kind of local colour he would have passed by without thought in his old life. Then she smiled and closed the door. Hunting through the fire basket for the smaller pieces at the bottom, she wedged an offcut of ash into the hinges. Only then did she turn around and, shimmering like heat over water, turn into someone else. Frank didn't recognise this woman either for a moment, misled by the colour scheme. But the once white shift was the same, somewhat stained now, but still cinched at the waist with a belt stitched with little seed pearls. Her stature was the same, tall, Amazonian, indomitable. Her features looked different now. The skin was darker, with dark eyes. The tumbling hair black raven rather than flax. But they weren't different. It took him a while to see it, but they weren't. "Mirela?" He covered his mouth to keep in the cry of joy, but it escaped through the edges in the form of a laugh. You're safe, thank God, I thought... He gestured at her, trying to encompass the change, crown to soul. How? She hesitated again, then sank to the chair as if the explanation was to be a long one. Frank settled on the edge of his bed to listen. The changing? She shrugged. I found out I could do that about 10 years ago. That was when many of my clan began to be able to do small things, when the fortune-tellers began to speak true. I don't know more than that. I woke up one day and knew I could, that's all. Frank looked at his hands, remembering grasping light and darkness in them, as if they were swatches of silk and velvet, materials he could caress and hold, draw around himself at will. I can do something equally unbelievable myself, he confessed, though I only discovered it a month ago. It hasn't made you strong. Frank laughed again, astonished at her insolence and oddly pleased. Never had he more appreciated straightforwardness than after this week of doubt. No, I don't think anything ever could. But tell me what happened after I left you. I thought you'd got away. They speak in thoughts to one another, the Strigoi. She walked envious fingers up the teeth of the comb he had been given, laid out on the desk along with shaving gear, pitcher and ewer. Strigoi. Frank had heard the word many times, but none of his conversational partners had had the linguistic pedantry to define it to his satisfaction. Evil spirit was his best guess. The thing that attacked us. Wait! There's more than one? Perhaps because he had not rebuked her for touching the comb, she now picked it up and began unsnarling the tangles of her hair. You really don't know anything, do you? She said, half pitying, and, he thought, half pleased to be able to talk down to him. He found it an unexpected benefit of having forgotten most of his life, that he had no pride left to wound. I don't know anything. Please tell me what that thing was, and everything you know about it. With one side of her hair tended, bouncing into large loose curls, she started on the other. A Strigoi is the spirit of an evil person. When the person first dies, the spirit is a mist, as all spirits are. But this one is too afraid of judgment to leave this earth. It slips back instead into the body it used to have. It cannot stop the body from decaying in the way of all flesh, but by drinking the blood of living men it can slowly build itself a new one, a better one. All day it sleeps in the grave. All night it is like the plague. It hunts by smell. It slays whoever it wills, and those it kills return as Strigoi themselves. Just as the bite of a mad dog passes on its madness, the bite of a Strigoi passes on its evil. A ghost that drinks blood. Frank's back chilled. He twitched his shoulders to dislodge the prickly feeling of a cold gaze resting there, and winced at the ache. It can become solid when it pleases? Yes. When it's hungry it bites above the heart and pierces it, drinks you down fast. When it's playing, it bites you above the eyes and drains you slowly from the top down. Frank felt inclined to say what nonsense, but recognised that his fatuous faith in an enlightened world where these things did not happen was thoroughly disproved. And that's what Vacarescu is? Mm-hmm. Odd how deep the sense of betrayal went. Surely this was no more than he had suspected himself. When had he begun secretly hoping for something else? Then he stumbled back into clear thought. Wait, though. You said they sleep in the day? I've seen Vacarescu in the day, riding about. He waved a hand at the window in illustration. Out doing things. Mirela had given up her attempt to plait her unruly hair. The plaits would keep springing apart at the end, the moment she let go of them. Bold as brass, she was now rummaging in the clothes chest at the foot of Frank's bed. But she looked up in confusion when he said this. Constantine Vacarescu. Frank could have kicked himself. Could only hope that his idiotic slowness was the lingering result of head injury and not his natural state. Of course. No, the young one, Radu. He's just a lackey, she said dismissively, coming up with the trousers and long shirt Frank had been wearing when he was rescued. They had been laundered and put away carefully, even though Elia had been horrified at the thought of a gentleman of his calibre ever wearing such lowly garments again. He thinks he's in charge, but it's they who are the true power. Constantine and his wife. May I have these? Take them. His wife? Frank's head was still more than a half hollowed out by forgetting, and it was true that a lingering headache made thoughts hard to string together. But really, when had he seen any other noblewoman in this household? Your mother and I, Constantine had said, and she had been sitting there, sewing, with that look of ancient serenity on her child's face. Not a liar? But of course it would be a liar, whom he had never seen except at night, the little gilded porcelain doll with the gentle eyes. Yes. Mirela pulled the shirt on over her shift. It came down to her knees like an overdress, and she sighed, rubbing her hands together as if to get some warmth into them. It was she who captured me, the night we met. I thought for sure I was dead, but instead she wanted to make a daughter-in-law of me. I didn't expect that. Possibly some part of Frank had already known this. Looking back, he remembered Radu Vacarescu, slumped in exhausted sleep on the end of his bed, after trying to stay awake all night, and all day too for a week. Silently, stubbornly, and without any thanks from Frank, he had been trying to protect his guest from the monster in his house. He's not a lackey, Frank thought, fiercely defensive, and felt no surprise at his sudden sea change of emotion. This made sense, and it was joy he felt at last, joy at finally having firm ground under his feet. Now, perhaps, he could stand up and begin to act. Would you have married him? He asked, perhaps idly. Of course. Mirela grinned at him, in the act of pulling on the trousers under her other layers. And I would have found a way to kill Strigoi for good. Then my sons would be boyars, and my daughters would marry princes. She laughed. Can you imagine that? I would come back dressed in cloth of gold and make the village that once owned me kneel down at my dirty gypsy feet. Frank smiled at her vehemence. She made him feel braver just being there, fierce and undaunted and irrepressible. But he didn't think I was good enough for him, she finished, hard-mouthed, with her head bent as she tied his unwanted green sash around it for a scarf. Then he's a fool, said Frank, honestly enough. I don't think they would really have let him in any case. That wasn't about you. It was about them trying to get him to move to Bucharest and him refusing. Why can't they just go on their own, by the way? I don't know. I don't know why they can't make him do what they want with mind control. That's how they get round everyone else. But if they can't control him with their wills, then in the daytime they must be vulnerable to him. Perhaps if they went alone, he would follow and bring them back. I don't know. The only important thing for me to know is that they have sworn not to touch their own servants. So now I'm a maid here, and I'm safe. What keeps them from meeting you? Long nights of resentful card games. The young lord not leaving until dawn. Maybe they're just waiting until I can give them a better run. They are cruel, she agreed, her face clouding over as though she spoke from recent memory. And you're right. They like to give their prey a head start, though sometimes that doesn't work for them so well. She wriggled the wooden wedge out of the door, and as she did so she was abruptly a different woman, a much less fantastically dressed one. All the new courage, on which he had been congratulating himself, seemed to run out of Frank's hands. "You're not leaving?" "I have work to do, fires to rake and make." "You'll come back?" He offered her his most charming, most helpless smile. It worked, as it so often did. "Oh, if you wish. And then we'll work out how to kill them together. We'll put a proper end to all of this." Mirela opened the door and checked the emptiness of the passageway beyond, before she returned to pick up her sack of coal. Her smile did not look as twisted or as harsh on her new face as it would on her old. "If it was that easy, do you not think it would already be done?" She shook her head, and stepping out of the room, closed the door behind her. Frank tried to wind himself up to heroic action, but he couldn't seem to find the spring. He wrestled his tall boots on and stood. If his time to act was running down, and he was increasingly convinced he was no hero who could slay the monster and rescue the princess himself, perhaps what he needed was to find himself a champion who could. The sound of cutlery on china plates, incongruously mundane in this medieval castle, drew Frank to a small dining room. There he found the housekeeper, supervising two of the maids as they cleared the remains of a light lunch from the board. "Oh," she smiled. "Master Frank, I didn't know you were up. Please have a seat, and Oana will bring you some breakfast." "Feeding me up for them," Frank joked, and regretted it when the matronly woman flinched. This was no more her fault than it was his. "I'm doing what I can to make your stay a pleasant one while it lasts," Anka said, with some dignity. She buried her hands in her apron and twisted it, as though she were breaking the neck of the Christmas goose. "What else can I do?" "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, He intercepted some of the serving dishes before they made it off the table, and ate a swift patchwork meal of sarmales, branzvace, and small beer. "I have just become aware of my situation. I didn't mean to take it out on you. I hope you'll accept my apology." Her laugh sounded as though he had managed to hurt her again in the same place, but she only patted down her skirts and waited until he was done before clearing his plate away. "Of course, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "I would welcome coffee, and a chance to talk to your lord. Do you know where he is?" "In the library, sir. Oana will guide you, and I'll bring the coffee up to you both." The weather had cleared as he ate. Frank found himself ducking down. The library's door was made for an older time, when people must have been both thinner and shorter, and coming through into a place a little like a church, lit brightly by sunlight. It was wood-panelled like all the rooms he had seen so far, but the panelling was covered in curlicues painted in 1,000 medieval devices. Little oddities lurked among the shelves. As he walked through a shaft of rainbow light, from a window depicting some biblical scene in which all the players looked like Cossack horsemen, his fingers trailed over carvings. Here was a man curled up tight, laughing fit to burst his belly. Next, a field mouse, poking an inquiring nose out of the sound hole of a stringless lute. The books themselves nestled among the painted and sculpted exuberance as if, as must indeed be the case, it had been made for them. Bindings of gilded leather and fine cloth embroidered with tiny stitches. Better than that, along one high shelf a dozen yards of ancient folded palimpsests, no backs on them, so the stitched folds of the spine were visible between boards heavy with clumsy jewels. Above that, where one needed a step-ladder to reach, the shelves had been turned into deep alcoves, and each one was haphazardly stuffed with scrolls. Frank had not yet remembered, beyond scholar, what it was he had been intending to do with his life. But at the sight of the library, of all those books, something in him took flight for joy. He read the nearest titles, frowned, peering at the nearby shelves, not alphabetically ordered, nor by subject. Was there? A large volume was set up on a reading stand in the centre of this first room. An index of some sort, he thought, trying to work out the scheme by which the collection was organised. Each bookshelf bore a coat of arms on the top, bright with colour and rampant with fierce animals. Perhaps, but no, there was no reference to the blazons in the index, nor did the shelves seem to be numbered. As for the scrolls, he wasn't sure they were recorded in this book at all. He was evening up a gap on the bookshelf closest to the door, sliding a taller volume out of the centre and replacing it next to brothers of its own size, when the housekeeper reappeared in a scent of cinnamon and bitterness, with a coffee pot on a silver tray and a slightly more genuine smile. At this reminder, Frank's delight faded enough to allow him to remember that he had not come here simply to explore the library. But oh, that was a bonus. All these books. This is wonderful. No wonder he doesn't want to leave. Have you got no further than the anteroom? There's more? Follow me. At the far end of the room, a bookshelf had been built out from the right-hand wall in such a way as to look like part of the far wall. When she passed it, the optical illusion was broken, and he saw there was a space between the two, just wide enough for a short passage, and another of those narrow doors. Grinning, Frank followed through a grey oak portal, ancient and studded with nails, set into a doorway that pierced a wall so thick it felt like a passage. On the other side, 3 deeply worn steps brought him to a floor as crazily humped and warped as a sea serpent's back. At the end of this room, a section of what looked like bookshelf proved to be a last door, cunningly painted and carved, fooling the eye, and even confusing the idle hand a little. Through this, another short flight of steps brought them to the inner sanctum, a round room of chestnut and gold, with a large desk and an indescribable chaos of stacked volumes and scattered papers. Windows encircled him, and when Frank looked out, he saw he was in a turret built out at the edge of a mountain, only sky and a deep fall in every direction. 100 feet beyond the glass, direct at his eye level, a Gaia falcon floated on braced wings, gazing with haughty eyes at the tiny scurrying things down on the distant valley bottom. Radu Vacarescu sat at the desk with a pen in his hand, and a large volume of what looked like accounts open before him. His head was propped on his fist, and his hair trailed in the ink. He couldn't quite manage to hide the start of coming awake when Anke put the tray of coffee down by his elbow, but he tried. Frank could see why he dared sleep here. Even with the bookish clutter, stepping into the room was like stepping into a floating bubble of light, clear, clean, all but holy. Wordlessly, Anke left. Vacarescu gave Frank a slow, inscrutable look, and waited for him to speak. At the level grey gaze, so like the clarity of the room, comforting and bleak all in one, Frank discovered he didn't know what to say. Starting with, "So, I hear your family are demons," seemed crass. Starting without it seemed false. He pulled out one of the heavy mahogany chairs and settled into it with a sigh. Vacarescu set his pen down in its holder and recognised, perhaps, the silent plea for help. "I'm glad to see you up and about. Have any memories returned?" "Some," Frank smiled. "Yes, best to work up to it in the course of conversation. Mostly it's pre-verbal things, attitudes, things I take for granted. I can feel the rest of it pushing up onto the surface like a geyser readying to blow." Vacarescu returned the smile. And perhaps it was Frank's new knowledge that freed the expression from the layers of irony he had read into it before. Perhaps it was only that this was the first time they had spoken unobserved, and the man felt able to shed 1 or 2 layers of armour. At any rate, it was a small and pleasant smile, laced with sympathy around the edges. Perhaps then it will be easier on you to tell you this now. He rose and went to look out of one of the windows, presenting his dull blue back to Frank's gaze. I'm afraid we've found 2 bodies in the Alt, which we think are the remains of the other 2 English scholars, the friends you mentioned. 1 shot, 1 the victim of some kind of explosion. It was better to hear this now, Frank agreed, when he couldn't recall why he should grieve. But the news did jog something free of the logjam of his scattered thoughts. Was there a 3rd Englishman? A flash of tall boulders and a familiar face on the wrong end of a rifle, smoke as Frank watched him fall. He would have been among the bandits, in the rocks by the side of the river. I don't know, I have the feeling it was not a random attack. We found no other bodies, except for a couple of gypsies washed up further downstream. If the man fell among his comrades, however, they are likely to have taken him away to bury. Vacarescu turned, and leaning back against the windows, light-limbed by the empty sky, he gave Frank a look of sharp interest. Why would there be an assassin on your trail? Who are you, or what have you done to merit that? I would very much like to know that myself. An impasse again, as Frank searched for a way of changing the subject gracefully. But there was none. How did you say, are you a lackey or a prisoner of the things that dwell in your house with you, without causing offence? Frank had forgotten many things, but not the casual strength of Vacarescu's backhand blow. He could still feel it, like a fresh graze on his cheek. He picked up the coffee pot by way of distraction, poured the thick bitter brew into 2 small cups. Shall I be mother? The smile again in response, just far enough from being mocking to verge unkind. Vacarescu came slowly back to the desk, as if reeled in by a careful fisherman. What? It's what we say in England if we're going to pour the tea. Frank added sugar to his coffee and sipped. Ugh, it's horrible. But it kicked him in the chest like a mule and set his heart galloping. Abruptly he was tired of his own cowardice, tired of the invisible restraints of what must have been a suffocatingly polite upbringing. Surely he could allow himself to be rude when his life was at stake. He waited until Vacarescu was close enough to pick up his own cup, the carved amethyst stone of his signet ring gleaming a purple so dark it was almost black, as he curved his fingers around the handle. Tell me about the Strigoi, he said. Vacarescu did not recoil, but he stiffened, and there was a long pause while he stared at the dark froth of his coffee, his head bent. Frank took the chance to steady his own breathing and congratulate himself on a small victory over his own shortcomings. The smile had gone when Vacarescu looked up, replaced with the hard-mouthed, surly look with which Frank was much more familiar. Either you have just remembered that word, or the servants have been gossiping. Which? Does it matter? Frank waved the question away before he could succumb to the urge to answer it. I'm glad to know where I stand. Did you know that one of them attacked me on the way here? He couldn't quite interpret the flash of something through those pale eyes. Fury or guilt. It could have been either. Vacarescu said nothing, just watched Frank coolly, waiting for him to come to the point. So Frank did. Until last night I thought it was you. You have the same stature, the same eyes. It was dark, you understand. I only saw glimpses of the creature. This reaction was a little easier to pass. Surprise and then understanding. Ah, that explains a great deal. You thought a liar was protecting you from me, rather than the other way round. What happened last night to change your mind? I saw Constantine. He looks like you. Vacarescu huffed a silent laugh. I look like him. He turned to open one of the great glass fronts of the bookshelves, where a series of tall books bound in blue regressed from the jewel-like present to tattered, faded pasts. Taking out one of the older volumes, he laid it, to Frank's distress, flat on the table. No wonder the spine was broken, and loose pages stuck out at angles from segments that had slipped their glue. When his bibliophile soul had protested long enough, Frank looked down at the page his host had opened for him. And there was Constantine, stiffly drawn in the centre of a medieval illumination, surrounded by other stiffly drawn horsemen, with long hair and aggressive moustaches, and fur hats trimmed with pearls. It was not by any means a wonderful likeness, but the little illustrated man was white-clad from head to foot, just as he had been last night. The artist had coloured his eyes with sheet silver, and they gleamed cold as Russian winters whenever Frank tilted his head. He was one of Voivode Dracul's men. Vacarescu sat with the air of one repeating a well-worn story. The ancestry of his house, his own story in a way. For Frank knew enough about being noble-born to understand how one's ancestors breathe through you with every breath. Vlad Dracul, the folk hero. Indeed, a wry look. A great man who fought back the Turks and stamped out the corruption of his nobles and enabled the common folk of Wallachia to live in prosperity under a law that applied to all. He angled the book so that he could look at it too, and brushed an affectionate fingertip along the illustration. Frank held back a protest at the thought of what the touch was doing to the delicate colours and paper. I'm named after Dracul's brother, Radu said, unexpectedly. But the softening in his tone ran out, left it cold again. The useless one. The collaborator who ruled Wallachia as a puppet of the Turks for a time. Radu the Beautiful, catamite of Sultan Mehmet II. He closed the book with a snap. Frank made a little noise of sympathetic pain on its behalf. It is appropriate enough. Now I rule this bannet as a puppet of my ancestor, as every son of the line has done since Dracul's day. Frank understood the feeling of shame, powerless, impotent shame, the inability to be what one's ancestry demanded. He smothered a desire to reach across the desk and curl a hand reassuringly around his host's wrist. Not only would it be in no way appropriate, he wasn't yet convinced Vacarescu was as trapped as he wanted Frank to think. Why would Constantine pass the title down? Wouldn't it make more sense for him to keep hold of it? Vacarescu snorted with scorn. Constantine died and was buried. This is a known fact. Dead men may not own property. Dead men may not rule. But if they have children, they can come back and carry on telling those children how to live, and those children... I do not know how it is in your country, but here children are brought up to honour their elders. It is not unknown for a 50-year-old man still to be ruled by his 80-year-old father. Our family's case is only a more extreme version of that. Except the father is a murderer and the son knows it. Oh, Lord. Frank's own hypocrisy startled him. Where had that come from? What made him think, when he was dogged by his own unrevealed crime, that he could afford to stand on the moral high ground? When Vacarescu reacted by rising from his seat, grabbing Frank by the collar and dragging him across the desk, scraping his weight across a fragile ancient text as if he didn't care that the pages would tear under the stress, Frank really could not blame him. "The book!" Frank gasped, terribly conscious of knuckles against his throat, pressing into the beat of the great vein, slowing the pulse of his blood. His head filled with grey fog as he tried to pry the fingers off. "You'll damage it!" He was dropped sharply. Vacarescu moved away like a man recoiling from temptation. "Of course the book," he said in disbelief. When Frank caught himself before he could land on it and carefully replaced the dislodged pages in their place, holding it like a holy thing, he gave again his not-quite laugh. "What strange priorities you have." Returning to the window, Vacarescu sighed and bowed to rest his forehead against the glass, a small and weary gesture. "Perhaps you are owed the full story. This is how it is, then. When Constantine died, his young wife sickened and died but a month later, leaving a babe in arms. The child was cared for, during the day, by the family of one of his retainers. At night, he was raised by dead parents. He felt all the love for them any boy feels for his mother and father. When he was old enough to command, he was glad to accept the duty of protecting them in return. As is the custom in this land, they found him a wife. Their first child was a girl, on whom the whole family doted. But then they had a son. He spread both hands on the glass on either side of his head, an oddly cruciform posture that Frank found upsetting. The family lived until the son was weaned. And then, mysteriously, mother, father, and daughter died, leaving the infant child to be raised by his grandparents, with no memory of any other carers. This is how it's been now for nearly 300 years. For 1,000 generations, Constantine and Elia have been father and mother to each singular son. He turned, his new smile drawn like a dagger. A tested and satisfactory system indeed, don't you think? Frank did not. All this time they've been terrorising the country. Why do the people stand for it? I see why your commoners are running away now. I don't see why they didn't do it 3 centuries ago. Have you never wondered why wolves and deer can live in the same forest? Why the deer do not simply go away? Why the wolves do not simply eat them all at once? Frank knew about books. He had not a clue about the eating habits of wolves. No? Radu Vacarescu had eyes that gleamed with the same chill as those of his ancestor. Hard and faintly inhuman. Raised by monsters, Frank thought, and surprised himself by finishing, "just like me." "There is a balance," said Vacarescu, as easily as if he was discussing partridge shooting season and not murder. A prosperous community can afford to lose a few of its weaker members a year. Those who are dying of cankers or agues, those whose malice sees them cast out from their villages to wander after dark. Criminals, runaways, bandits, and occasionally willing sacrifices chosen by lot. Our people have ruled here since before the Romans, and on the whole we have ruled well. Having seen the chaos of other banats under absentee lords, the occasional cull is something our peasants are willing to endure. Frank remembered doors left gaping, cold fires and silence while the flowers withered in the unwatered gardens. Yet now you're losing villagers overnight. That's got nothing to do with the fact that their ruling family is 2/3 demon. 300 years after the fact and they suddenly decide to care. Scorn. Hardly. And like it or not, Radu had a point. Then what changed? You may find it hard to believe, but what changed was politics. Do you remember that I mentioned that Vlad Dracul disposed of a number of treacherous boyars? Disposed of? Impaled. The surviving boyars did not take this lesson to heart, he said. We have been under the thumb of the Sultan so long we have lost all our pride, learned simply to scrabble for whatever scraps he throws. We have grubbed for wealth and used it to buy our way to the voivode's throne. Promised loyalty, reneged whenever it suited us, spineless and worthless, fit only to be placed in a locked room and set on fire. He paused, genuinely angry, with an anger that reminded Frank of another man, of a hawk face, spindly fingers, iron hair cropped close to go under a periwig. Frank's father, Arthur Carew, Earl Hungerford, a man who regarded the perfect honour of his family as an extension of his own good name. Oh! Frank put a hand over his mouth to keep this revelation from flying away. He had a name and a family. How about that? With our boyars squabbling, we have been easy pickings for conquerors from every nation under the sun. Vacarescu had not noticed the moment of revelation, absorbed in his own concerns. About 20 years ago, the Ottomans gave us up to the Austrians. Though we might have expected better treatment from fellow Christians, the Austrians regarded us as a convenient source of wealth and squeezed us hard for it, until the peasants had to choose between paying the taxes and feeding themselves. 3 years ago, under the Treaty of Belgrade, we were passed back to the Sultan. He decided he could not trust any of our own boyars to rule in his name, and put a Greek slave on the throne. He sighed again bitterly. If this was supposed to make things better, I'm not sure how. The Turks have left us at the mercy of a foreign prince, for whom ruling this country is a marvellous opportunity for getting rich on the suffering of strangers. He put the taxes up. He rubbed at his frown with a clenched fist, helpless and angry at it. Since, under this punitive system, they cannot work hard enough to feed themselves, there is little else the peasants can do but to leave their homes and either turn to banditry or find another country where they can. Hence the exodus of whole villages into Transylvania, where conditions are better. My parents are not stupid. They have been restraining themselves for centuries, taking only what can be supported. We had achieved a balance that was workable for everyone. But with fewer peasants, the balance is tipped. With the Turks driving our people away, the Strigoi must restrain themselves more, feed less. They are old and proud and famished. They take to being starved no better than anyone else. This will not end well. Frank folded his arms around his stomach and held on. He was not cold, snuggled into his borrowed fur-lined coat as he was. And that gave him pause, for it was Vacarescu's coat. His clothes that Frank wore. His hospitality Frank had been relying on since the rescue. His nights that had been sacrificed to make it more awkward for the monsters to drain Frank dry. All of that generosity, and Frank had so far only repaid him with hard words and accusations. He had not yet given Frank an explanation for why he had not rid his people of this blight for good, but perhaps he... Oh, but he hadn't he? A single solitary son in every generation. In every generation, Constantine and Elia had been Mummy and Daddy before they had been anything else. Frank looked around the beautiful room a little wildly, searching for something that would take the nausea out of this sudden understanding. But because Frank remembered little save unrelenting disappointment from his own father, and still he didn't believe he could ever bring himself to raise a hand to the man. Frank thought again of Elia, with her huge eyes and her practised, patient sweetness, the charm of her smile. He could see her with a small boy in her arms, both of them poring together over the illuminated histories, while she instilled in him a pride in his own blood. Did Frank really expect Vacarescu to kill his own mother? Whatever she was otherwise, she was still that. I'm sorry. Astonishment made Vacarescu's black brows twitch like raven wings. All of his expressions were harsh, and perhaps that was why Frank had been so slow to see him as a man who could be hurt like any other. About what? You saved my life, and although you joked with me about repayment, you haven't demanded any. My presence in your house has made trouble for you. I may be bringing danger to you, I certainly feel as though I am. All you've done has been to treat me with open-handed kindness, and I repay you with accusations. Vacarescu's surprise devolved into astonishment, an oddly lumpen look on a face meant for certainty. Had the man never been apologized to in his life that it took him so aback? You do not accuse me of anything that I do not already despise myself for. And now even this room felt tainted with despair. Frank had no timepiece, but the sun was not yet high in the sky. Almost the whole day lay ahead of them, and though there was a night to come after that, he had survived a number of them already. No rush just yet. There was time to find out more about his situation, fit the pieces of information together, and work out a solution. Time to stop attacking before he turned away the best friend he had left. Speaking of friends, Frank hugged himself a little harder. It hurt, but that was good. He deserved it. You said you found my friends. Did you bury them? Vacarescu looked relieved at this change of subject. His expression was appropriately respectful, but the tension of his shoulders eased. Yes. It was done quickly as soon as the priest could arrive. What we can do in this country to prevent other strigoi from arising, we do thoroughly. Do I want to know what that entails? They had been violently slain. There was a risk they would not lie easy in the ground. The usual precautions were taken. And I don't want to know what those are. A brief, winter chill smile. Probably not. Would you like to visit the graves? Choking horror filled Frank at the thought. No, he was not ready to write the end and draw a line under his friends' lives. Not before he was sure he remembered them properly. He wanted to regain their lives before he had to come to terms with their deaths. You said we had come to study the vril accumulator? It was so frustrating. Frank could almost recall someone, a grin of delight and a flutter of multicoloured talismans, deft hands tying pierced stones into a complex knotwork of little ribbons. He chased after a name, a face, but only found a picture of copper struts folding out over water, a moonstone ball that looked like a compass spinning past markings of brass. I don't remember what that is. Vacarescu unearthed a book from beneath one of the piles on his desk, pulled out a folded letter from among its pages, and handed it to Frank. Just the shape of the handwriting made him breathe in hard, as if he'd been struck in a place deeper than flesh. I didn't know it by that name either. Here we call it St. George's Cloak, and it's a place the peasants go when they're sick or injured in the hopes of a cure. Your friend explains in there that it's some sort of device of great interest to students of theurgy, and a jewel beyond price of which your country may be justly proud. He laughed. I think he thought me some savage to be placated with fine words. He signs himself James Prothero, if that means anything to you. Frank closed his eyes to hold in sudden tears, because yes, it did. It meant acceptance where he had feared horror. It meant the heroism of one who would hug a leper with no thought of his own health. A true friend. I should see it for him, if it meant so much to him. Is it a long way away? Not far. Frank's eyes were still closed. He should have startled up in shock when a large hand landed on the back of his neck, cool and gentle. He probably shouldn't have relaxed and lifted his head so the slowly rubbing thumb slid up his nape into his hair. But it was comforting, and he had his eyes closed so he could tell himself it wasn't really happening. He was only wishing it in the careful privacy of his own mind. "An hour on horseback with a guide. I'll take you there now if you wish." The voice too was behind him, quiet and wry. Then the hand went away, fingers opening and trailing across his skin, leaving individual trails of sensation. The sound of booted feet treading carefully away. Long strides. When he opened his eyes, Vacarescu was again on the other side of his desk. "I imagined it," Frank told himself firmly, but he felt much strengthened nevertheless. "I would love to get out of here," he agreed. "Am I allowed?" Vacarescu checked his pocket watch. His small smile looked cruel, but Frank was now willing to bet that was just a result of physiognomy rather than of character. "At 11:10 in the morning, there is no will in this country that overrules mine, and I say you are allowed." Thanks for listening. That was Chapter 4 and part of Chapter 5 of Sons of Devils. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers, read by Galadir. The story continues in the next episode when we find out a lot more about the Vril accumulator and things come to a head in the Vacarescu house.